There was a recent request specifically for the Fireblast variant of the Trap Assassin, and while I know the core build and have used it a few times, I did not know the state of many guides related to the build online. Needless to say, researching it sent me down a rabbit hole, which may need a video of its own after this. But let's just say, be careful what you believe when sites or posts tell you optimal gear, because several of them give this build with items that simply cannot spawn or even be crafted, and this is not the only build with this issue. But this build commonly has the Witch Hunter's Claw of Quickness, with Fireblast placed as its best in slot staff mod, but unfortunately, this item cannot be spawned. Not by enemies dropping them, and not even by crafting them with chipped gems. This is because tier 1 skills, which Fireblast is, requires an item level of 24 or lower, and the lowest claw that gets plus skills is 41 naturally, and even with chipped gems able to drop that down, it can only go up to 25. So if you're wanting extremely rare crafted claws, your best bet is re-rolling rare runic talons on a low-level character with perfect skulls, since that can get low enough to be below that 24 mark. But don't get your hopes up. They are near impossible to get, and you have to use very specific claws to be able to get the good plus skills and quickness mod. All that aside, the build itself, even without outlandish gear, is a solid option for playing once you get used to the throw delay of Fireblast itself, since it is essentially just a modified Trap Assassin with a lot more points into the direct traps, rather than Death Sentry and support abilities like a normal Trap Assassin. And since Fireblast works with -% resist, unlike the other traps, you can get a sorceress-like result with your damage output and -resist gear. Speed-wise, it's about on par with other Trap Assassins. Faster in areas where the normal trappers would be slowed down by lightning without the drawbacks of some of the other alternate trappers. And if you want to see it in action with some more laid-back gameplay, I did toss up one of the sessions of it over on the game sampler page. You'll find it linked in that little mark in the top right, and if I remember, the description as well. Skill-wise, we'll obviously be investing a lot into traps. This is because the main skill of this build is Fireblast, which gets synergy boost from almost every trap on the tree, with only a few exceptions. And while the damage on the skill itself is not insane, the fact that it's a decent area of effect that works off of attack speed rather than casting speed makes it relatively easy to work with as far as gear options go, since it's easier to boost attack speed on the assassin. That said, you can never 100% max it out, since it would take more skill points than you get while playing. Now, to boost this up, we do invest in the other traps, with the lightning side being my preference since it gives us another damage type while still feeding back into the beast. The two most important being Lightning Sentry for a nice range sweep, and that we use just like we do in the normal Trap Assassin, and the other one being Shockweb, which has a handful of uses since you can stack it up in an area such as between Bale Waves. We also want to grab that 1 point into Death Sentry just because it doesn't feed back into the other stuff, but still deals plenty of damage with its corpse explosions, making it handy for a large number of encounters even without the extra hardpoint investments. As far as the rest of our skills, usually my fourth priority is Charged Bolt Sentry, just to make sure our lightning branch is filled up to its maximum, making it easier to farm a variety of areas. After that, it's just into the fire traps, though if you're playing through without resetting your skills, you'll likely already have points in the ever-popular Wake of Fire, though I would also get 1 point into the Wake of Inferno in the endgame just to have some fire damage you can deal to enemies sitting off the edge of a map. Now, since there is no way to get enough points to get all the synergies maxed out, we obviously will be a little short on some skills, but still need support abilities, of which there's a few options. The only mandatory one, though, is Burst of Speed, since Fireblast is a spam skill, and we don't want to lose all our plus skills trying to get attack speed. It's pretty much a go-to skill. Some optional picks that reduce your blast damage but make life easier are skills such as Mind Blast and Shadow Master, with Blast giving you conversion effects if you need protection, and Shadow Master giving you an extra tank. Though I find both of these unnecessary with the endgame gear, they can help out while going through solo self-found, but they don't do anything to speed up your clearing of a given area, just your ability to avoid pain in them. Though speaking of going solo self-found, the order you do the skills in if you don't want to reset your skills can be a bit mixed up compared to what you think, with Wake of Fire being your kick-butt tool for normal difficulty, especially if you can make a Leaf Staff out of Tyr and Rawl in, well, Act 1, though it is important to make it in a short staff unless you want your Fireblast and Trap laying to be arduously slow. Though your 1 point wonder and burst of speed can help out here a little bit, you want a fast staff. So generally, I'll mix and match between Wake of Fire and Fireblast while going through normal, depending on how my mana situation is going. Mana good, Fireblast. Mana bad, Wake of Fire. just kind of like saves it a bit. You can also spend a little bit of time getting a lore and a stealth or the supplies to make them, but they're not as integral to this build. They're just handy, though any plus skills will be welcome regardless, especially as you start to get into higher difficulties. Now, as you get into Nightmare, you'll generally be starting on your path into Lightning, but also continuing to wrap up the investment in Fireblast itself. For Nightmare, the first half you'll probably still be using those fire traps combined with Blast, since Lightning will still be a little weak at that point, even though Lightning Sentry should be solid enough to rely on as you get into your 50s and 60s, where you'll have 20 Lightning Sentry, 20 Fire Blast, 1 Death Sentry, with a spattering and Wake of Fire from earlier, and Shockweb getting started as your first Lightning synergy. In that Nightmare stage, you could also go with a Spirit Runeward Sword as well for plus skills, or if you're lucky, you may be able to find stuff like a plus skill Claw with plus to various traps towards the mid to late Nightmare stages that could be situationally better, though these will be lower value ones compared to what you can find later on in Hell. Speaking of Hell though, picking up a Spirit Shield is super useful for this build and is even an option you use in the endgame for a more lightning-oriented trap assassin, since you'd be leaning even more into the deployed traps rather than attack skills like Fire Blast. But since we are focusing on the spammable skills for the endgame, we will be replacing that when we dive into the chase gear. Though speaking of chase gear, there are some odd quirks you can consider while playing that will shift around depending on how you want to play the build, and there are of course GG items like we discussed earlier, such as the hard to get rares and such. But for most reasonable finds that you can actually farm without needing lottery level luck, we can focus it down to 2 playstyles: Fireblast only and Fireblast Hybrid. I prefer Fireblast Hybrid like you see in the background since it plays smoother. That means that while I do take plus fire skills in some slots, I'll favor plus all skills where it makes sense. And while I'll favor minus fire resist in some slots, it will only be in slots where it's not sacrificing too much for other skills, since we'll be using all of the above. If you are going pure Fireblast, however, you can lean into the minus fire resist and plus fire damage effects, with options like Dual Phoenix or even Phoenix plus a Hexfire socketed with a rainbow facet, though going into that kind of stuff is moving from general use to super niche and something that I don't think would be valuable to most players who want a smooth play experience. So with that in mind, here's what I prefer on my Fireblast Assassin. On the fire end, we go with Flickering Flame on the helmet, since thanks to Fireblast working with minus resist effects, which most other traps don't do, we can take advantage of both a Sundered Charm as well as the minus resist on this, not to mention the fire resist aura and plus fire skills that are pretty solid. We use this instead of Harlequin Crest, mostly because it works so well with the focus on direct fire damage. For a similar reason, we choose the Phoenix for the shield. Not only does it have, again, minus fire resist, but it also helps us sustain our mana a lot easier by providing us with the Redemption Aura, which no, does not ruin our ability to use Death Sentry. It's just, it eats the corpses every now and then. Death Sentry will still go off plenty of times. The main reason we use it in the shield slot, though, instead of the weapon, is we get more benefits from it here, like maximum resists and life, unlike the weapon. Not to mention, the weapon slot also provides better global boosts from other items. Which for me, I ended up going with Heart of the Oak for a more global boost, since I do use lightning skills on this build a decent amount. And it does help bring our Death Sentry up to a quite solid radius. If you were leaning more into fire, there are better options, and you could even go with a proper Winch Hunter's Claw of Quickness with proper stuff in the socket or sockets you nabbed with it from Larzuk, but Oak is just easier to throw in and go and doesn't require juggling specific claw types and re-rolling them not only for affixes, but also staff mods that naturally spawn on the higher level claws. Thankfully, the rest of our gear is fairly straightforward. The amulet is a plus skills amulet, in this case Mara's for resist, but depending on if you want teleport or not, you could hit up a caster amulet and go with Enigma, though with burst of speed we really don't need to worry too much, since if you're doing full clears rather than boss hunts, sprinting around will generally be almost as fast and give us a lot more durability. Though speaking of Enigma and the armor slot, I actually went with Chains of Honor instead. Both are good choices and work out just fine, but unless you are focusing specifically on targeted hunting like bosses and uniques, you don't really need teleport with this build in all but a few cases. That and having the ungodly durability provided by high resist is always welcome, especially since pretty much the only things that should be hitting you are going to be ranged elemental damage users anyway, and maybe some stray arrows. In the rest of our slots, it's fairly standard caster gear. Mage Fist providing us with plus fire skills and mana regeneration effects, and of course faster cast if you're going the Enigma route. Similar for Arachnid's Mesh on the belt, but this time all skills instead of just fire, and we're plucking in 2 Stones of Jordan. It's just gonna be my go-to on this, just for extra mana and plus skills. Though if you are going for faster cast breakpoints, you may need to swap one or even both out for the faster cast rings to hit the 86 or 102 breakpoints usually aimed for if you're going teleport heavy. And on the boots, use whatever you want. In this case, I went with War Travelers, though some people will go Silkweave and such, especially if they don't end up using Phoenix. Though do remember that mana per kill only applies to kills with your direct damage skills like Fireblast. It does not work with traps, and likely never will. You could also go with Resist here, which would kind of cut off the need for using, say, Chains of Honor, but I personally just like getting Magic Find here. For charms, it's just plus trap skillers and some resist and magic find small charms to top off stuff if you needed. Oh, and of course the Fire Sunder, since we are throwing grenades at things. That's our whole shtick, you know. And you probably can tell by my skill setup with Fireblast and Shockweb toggling on my left click for various jobs, and Burst of Speed and my deployable trap sitting on my right click to be swapped through there, depending on the enemy. And I do recommend actually punching through with the other traps while doing this. Don't be afraid to use Shockweb as well. It can be a handy support skill and be set in the way of annoying enemies to do some damage on their way to your normal traps. So overall, this build is one of my preferred trap variants, sitting pretty close to the Dragontail Trapper, which, while we haven't covered it directly yet, is the middle ground between the Kick Assassin you see on screen now and the build we just covered. So stay tuned for that build after we knock out a few of the other classes first.